It would be very hard to resist the message of today's gospel. Or at the very least, it would be very hard not to find it attractive. For who in their right mind would refuse to be freed from their burdens? Who in their right mind would refuse to rest from their labours? Who in their right mind would refuse a gentle and humble heart that promises to assuage the pains and pressures of our own hearts and souls? For is it not true, whether you be young or old, rich or poor, Mexican or Australian, Catholic or an atheist, that every human heart yearns to be happy? Life is a pilgrimage in pursuit of happiness. That's a very obvious point, but one we can easily overlook. Every decision you and I make, no matter how big or small, always reflects a desire to be happy. Even when we do something that's hard or difficult, ultimately we do it because we think there's something good here, something that will make us happy. Even if we might not want to do it first, we run away. Nevertheless, even there, we do it because in the long run, we think happiness depends upon it. But of course, that raises the critical question that we should all think about time to time. In fact, we should think about it all the time. What does it mean to be happy? And where do you and I find examples of happiness? And that's not as easy as we might think. I was telling our young pilgrims last night, they're going to World Youth Day, that when you discover happiness, when you see it, you'll often find it in the most unlikely of places. A very formative encounter for me about what makes people happy, what true happiness looks like, and what happiness is not, took place when I was visiting a small community of nuns of Mother Teresa in New South Wales, a very poor area of New South Wales that they were working in. And on many accounts, they are the kind of people that the world would say should be very unhappy. They should be miserable. In fact, the kind of life that they are living should be a life of misery if we follow the kind of normal parlance about what should make us feel good and feel better and, in ostensible secular terms, feel happy. They take vows of poverty, vows of chastity, vows of obedience. In fact, these Mother Teresa nuns take a fourth vow to give themselves wholeheartedly to the service of the poorest of the poor. And as an 18-year-old, being with those nuns, there was something unspeakably attractive. It was like they were luminous, like it was just something so attractive. And for a teenager, I thought, I just couldn't work it out. But you were in their presence. There was a peacefulness, a luminosity. But there was something far more profound than any worldly happiness. And it was only later that I came to realize that what they had was joy. And joy is something far more profound, far more powerful than happiness. Happiness tends to be sort of a feeling of kinds. We buy things and there's that feeling of a pleasant feeling. We go on holidays, there's a pleasant experience, but we come back and there's a sort of a level of emptiness there. We've got to go back to work, we've got to go back to doing the humdrum of day-to-day life. We kind of just look forward to the next thing that will going to make us feel happy again. But all those things come to an end. And the other thing about happiness is it fears suffering. We fear that something's going to go wrong. When we are saying, we are very precautious that that feeling's going to die. So we do everything we can to keep ourselves feeling safe. But joy is unmistakably different. Because unlike happiness, joy doesn't fear the cross. Crowds can't make sense of joy. The world can't make sense of joy. You glow when you shouldn't, like those nuns. They just sort of glow with a luminosity, something almost, and it is, supernatural. And no one can make sense of it. How can you have this gift? What do you have that I don't have? And, we can easily forget that. When we've experienced it, we think, that's exactly what I want. But then we go back into life and then we sort of pursue those kind of worldly happinesses. And so I remember there was sort of a trigger moment when I ran into the same order of nuns, but this time it was in a Westfield shopping centre in Shepherd's Bush in London. And I saw these Mother Teresa sisters sort of walking through, and I just sort of was immediately remembered that joy that I encountered when I was an 18-year-old. And I literally ran over to them. and they were sort of accosted by this sort of young priest in a Westfield shopping centre. I said, sisters, I want you to help me to become a saint. They sort of just looked mystified that this sort of young priest had, out of nowhere, had come up to them. But what it was is I could remember that joy, and I thought, that's what I really want. That's what I'm really looking for. Now, it's difficult to seek joy in the promises of Christ. It's difficult, especially for young people today. And so last week we celebrated the feast day of one of the patrons of World Youth Day, and I was telling again the young people last night about him. Most of you probably know about him. His name was Blessed Giorgio Frassati. He lived in the last century. And in worldly parlance, he had everything. He had it made. He was born into comfort and privilege, born into a prominent, wealthy Italian family, son to an atheistic father, nominally Christian mother. He was destined to inherit a large fortune, destined to be groomed into positions of elite social standing. So again, in the eyes of the world, there was no burdens there. He had every comfort, every consolation. He quite literally had every possible diversion and distraction one could imagine that could divert you from any pain, any suffering, from the cross. But there was something about Giorgio Frassati. He had this innocence, that childlike innocence that our Lord speaks of in the gospel. And so he saw the world very differently, even from the age of about 4 or 5. There was this detachment from worldly concerns and a desire to be generous and sacrificial that his parents could not make sense of. And so as a teenager, he said this. He said, we who are Catholics must not squander the best years of our life, as so many unhappy young people do, who worry about enjoying the good things in life, things that do not in fact bring about any good, but rather we should concern ourselves with immortality. And so from earliest days, he had this desire to use his time well. And so unbeknownst to the world, as the world goes on with financial transactions, buying and selling and all that sort of thing, he was doing everything he could to give away his wealth, secretly, going out into the poor communities, giving away anything that he had. And he was almost, he said, fully alive in the service of the poor. We don't find comfort in self-serving, but in serving others. That's where we find real joy. And as time went on, his interest in things like St. Vincent de Paul and confounded his parents and friends. They couldn't fathom why a boy as well off as him had no interest in money, so disinterested in the comforts that he could have. In fact, as you probably heard me say before, a friend of his saw him on a train and get off a train, and they said to him, Pier Giorgio, why are you in 3rd class? You're rich. You should be in 1st class. And Pier Giorgio just said, well, there's no 4th class. Now, where did that power come from? The worldly desire, he thought was a way to burden ourselves. When we are so concerned with the things of the world, if our heart is so fixated on things of the world, it's a heaviness. It's a heaviness on our shoulders. But the more we kind of let go of those concerns, the more that we take our Lord's word seriously, we realize that our Lord's burden, there is no burden. His burden is easy, light. His yoke is easy. Now, Pier Giorgio sadly dies at the age of 24, but even in his death, because he contracted polio from serving the poor, but even then, in his death, if you read the last days of his life, there's a profound joy even in his dying. It brought me to tears reading the last week of his life. It was profoundly moving. And he wanted his friends. He always wanted his friends. He was charming. He wasn't, just sort of a pious monk. No, he was a man that was fully alive, and people were attracted to him. He didn't want his friends to look down. He always told them, don't allow the worldly concerns to bury you. Look up, verso alto, he said, verso alto. When you are in the context of your own lives as sons and daughters of the church, if you have doubts about the church, don't delay. At once, run to Christ. Run and find and ask the questions. Don't carry that burden with you. If we are afraid of confronting the darkness of sin, then he says, at once go to confession. Unburden yourselves of that guilt or that shame that you're feeling. You don't need to carry that in your life. If we are bored by our prayers, then he would say, at once seek counsel. Don't allow yourselves to be burdened by the absence of that grace of a good prayer life. If we're tempted to dismiss the church's teachings, he would say, then at once study them. Talk to Christ, talk to someone that you trust, and embrace them. And then tell me you didn't find yourself become more alive. The more we give our hearts over to Christ and allow him to convince ourselves that in fact what the church has to offer is nothing but beauty and goodness and truth, then everything that we worry about, everything that stresses us, pales in comparison. Because Christ said, come to me, all you who labor and overburdened, and I will give you rest. And Christ doesn't lie.